Hey, everybody. We're back. It's Monday, June 5th. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Wanunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. Jill, it was lovely taking a week off. We got a lot of notes, people missing this pod, but rest assured, everyone, we're back. How was your week off?
Guess who's back? Back again. I mean, listen, while you and Alex were sunning and relaxing and tasting food and just enjoying life, I was getting poked and prodded. I had a colonoscopy. I had a mammogram. But, you know, you got to do what you got to do. And I'm glad that it's done. And that's it. How was your vacation?
I feel really bad talking about it now.
It's okay.
You're like, well, Moshe, I had a colonoscopy. How was your vacation? Jill, it was great. All among the advice that we hear from people is like, enjoy the time that you have, get your sleep in right now before the baby arrives in the fall. And so we definitely did that. Very much enjoyed. I've spent very little time in the Caribbean. Usually when we're going abroad, we're going kind of off to Europe or, South America or whatever. And really enjoyed this island of Anguilla. It's lovely people, very, very chill vibes there. So very much enjoyed that. And then as we got back here this weekend, we began kind of final countdown to the baby, beginning with stroller shopping, posted a video on Instagram, and no shortage of at least 1,000 comments from people with their opinions and perspectives on the best stroller to get.
There are a ton of decisions. Luckily for you and Alex, though, there is a certain Mo News podcast co-host who's about a year and change ahead of you guys in the baby game. And so you guys will be getting a lot of the stuff that we don't need anymore.
We greatly appreciate it. Jill, you've been very, very generous so far. And it extends, by the way, to the whole Wagner clan. We got a pack and play this weekend, care of your brother. So appreciate that as well.
Hand-me-downs are the best. And the truth of the matter is, and any parent will tell you, you don't use this stuff for a very long time. It has such a short shelf life. And even things that your baby needs, sometimes they just don't take to it, right? A certain bassinet, they just don't like it and they never sleep in it. So as much as you can get handed down, the better.
With that, Jill, we'll post a P.O. box for everyone to ship their hand-me-downs. To Mo News. We're taking what you got, folks, because yes, I keep hearing from people like this was relevant in my child's life for about 4 weeks, and I spent X amount of money on it. So.
Okay, with that, we missed you guys. We're so happy to be back, and let's get to some news here. Okay, let's start with politics. The race for the White House is getting crowded, at least on the Republican side. 3 more big names are expected to enter the race this week. Meta, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram, could soon be pulling news from its platform in California. We're going to be telling you what is behind that and some of the broader implications. What a new announcement about oil from Saudi Arabia could mean for gas prices. New details on the explosion that was heard over D.C. on Sunday. Why the racetrack that hosts the Kentucky Derby is canceling horse races for the rest of the summer. We're going to have an update from India, where a tragic train crash took place this weekend, killing hundreds of people. How the debt ceiling drama finally ended this weekend. And at long last, Apple is expected to show off its new virtual reality goggles. But Moshe, are any of us really going to buy these things?
It has a hefty price tag. We'll tell you about the end of the podcast, Jill.
All right. And Moshe has on this day in history.
Bueller. There are some film buffs, Jill, that have tried to figure out the exact date that Ferris Bueller actually took off, and we think we know it. It was today in history, and so we'll have that later in the pod.
All right, I can't wait. Let's start, though, with politics. This is going to be a big week in the presidential race, as at least 3 more Republicans will be jumping in the battle for the White House. Former Vice President Mike Pence, former New Jersey Governor Christie, and North Dakota Governor Doug Burgum are all set to enter in the next 48 hours or so with long shot challenges to frontrunner Donald Trump. Christie actually advised Trump's campaign back in 2016, only to become a very vocal critic of the former president. He will be formally announcing his 2024 campaign tomorrow. Pence, of course, served as Trump's vice president, but then lost his favor by refusing to support his effort to overturn the results of the 2020 election. Pence is set to enter the race on Wednesday. Also entering on Wednesday, the North Dakota governor, Doug Burgum. He is a billionaire, former software entrepreneur who sold his business to Microsoft about 20 years ago. The growing Republican field now approaching a dozen. Well, that concerns many Trump opponents inside the Republican Party. They fear that this large number of challengers will splinter the anti-Trump vote and basically hand the party's nomination to the former president, who can rely on at least 30% of the Republican base to back him. So they fear that it's going to be a repeat of 2016, where he was able to win primaries in part because there were 16 opponents splitting the vote. Let's get through a couple of the people entering, starting with Christie. Christie, now 60 years old. He was one of the candidates who ran against Trump and lost in 2016. While he defended and advised Trump early on in his presidency, even advising him for debates in 2020, he has since become one of Trump's most vocal critics. During a recent town hall in New Hampshire, Christie called Trump, quote, a failure on policy and a failure on character. He said, quote, everybody could be fooled once by a shuckster, but if we allow ourselves to be fooled twice, we have no one to blame but ourselves. And let me promise you, if he is the nominee in 2024, Joe Biden will be the president in 2025. Christie, who formerly led New Jersey, is a bit more moderate on social issues, and that could be challenging for him in the current Republican Party.
Jill, Christie is a long shot here, and they acknowledge that within the campaign. But he wants to make a point here that it is okay to criticize Trump. And the party, if it wants to move on and win next year, they have to get rid of the guy. So he could be a very interesting player here. He knows Trump very well. As you mentioned, he advised him. He was prepping him for debates in 2020. In fact, in the prep room ahead of the Trump-Biden debate, you had Christie advising him to just sit back and let Biden step over his words and fail and pause, etc. And you had Rudy Giuliani in the room reportedly saying, attack, 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 interrupt. It would turn out that Trump would go with Rudy's advice and not Christie's advice. Christie saying if he had just sat back, he would have been able to show the difference between the candidates. Regardless, it does mean he does know Trump well. He knows how to provoke the former president. And Christie is known as a very strong debater. He does get credit back in 2016 of taking down Marco Rubio as all these candidates were going against each other. And of course, Trump would win out. This time around, he's not going to be making that mistake. He's aiming all of his fire at Trump. By the way, Christie, also a former U.S. attorney, can speak to legal issues, including Trump's current indictment and likely upcoming indictments. He's going to be going on stage, going after Trump's unfulfilled promises, including not building that wall to Mexico and getting them to pay for it, his pledge to repeal Obamacare, which he never did. So that's what he's going to be focused on. Again, a long shot here, especially how populist the party has become. And he's polling in single digits right now. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Mike Pence getting in here. Mike Pence has been traveling to key primary states. He's leaned into issues that other Republicans aren't addressing, including saying, listen, Medicare, Social Security, these hard issues, we have to address them. And while many won't address them because it might mean changes to current policies, Pence says, I'm the guy who will talk about the hard issues. The other thing Pence has going for him is he speaks to the social issues, the very hardcore conservative-based social issues, including increased abortion restrictions. And there is a constituency, the evangelicals within the party, that could be responsive to it. Effectively, Pence is trying to bring back the Republican Party pre-Trump, the one of the Bush era of being globalist on foreign trade, a strong foreign policy, conservative social policies, before Trump really kind of remade the party. So that's what Pence is trying to do here. He is critical of Trump to a certain extent, especially around January 6th. Remember those January 6th rioters, some of them were literally yelling, hang Mike Pence, and trying to find him. And while he is critical of Trump, he also doesn't go after him, at least in the way Christie does. So you have those two getting the race. You also mentioned the North Dakota governor, who we don't know that much about. We'll get a better sense of that on Wednesday. And that adds to Ron DeSantis, Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley, former Arkansas Governor Asa Hutchinson, and several others. And by the way, we're not done yet. The mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, also considering getting in here. And the Virginia governor, Glenn Youngkin, also saying that he's considering a bid here. So this race could be, Baker's dozen. We might get up to the 16 number of 2016. Though keep in mind, the record holders right now are the Democrats. There were 26 Democratic candidates in 2020, and that was the group that Biden would eventually emerge from.
Speaking of the Democratic side, it was James Vanderbeek, Dawson himself from Dawson's Creek, who recently had took to social media to talk about how there was not going to be a debate on the Democratic side. And that got a lot of people talking. I know that we posted it on the Instagram account. A friend of mine who follows the account was like, what's up with that? This is making a lot of waves. People are not happy about this.
Yeah, so let's talk about the other side here for a second, right? Biden is the sitting president. We should say, despite what James Vanderbeek, Dawson is saying here, traditionally speaking, the incumbent president does not open themselves up to debates, right? Trump didn't in 2020. Obama did not in 2012. Bush did not in 2004. We can go back. If you're the sitting president, the party typically gets around you, rallies around you, and you're the nominee, and you're not going to open yourself up to debates. Now, James Vanderbeek and others say this is a different year. This is the oldest president in history. And Robert Kennedy Jr., Marianne Williamson are two of the people running against him, and they should have the opportunity to debate him. Now, the DNC and others are saying, no, we're going to go with the same policy that we've always gone with, which is this is the sitting president, and we're not going to open themselves up to debate. We're going to focus on the other side because we already have the White House, and we're going to try to keep the White House. But it is notable because several people were like, wait, why are we talking about debates right now? And I'm like, because Dawson's Creek, he wants to talk about it. But I don't mean to minimize it. Other people have been talking about it, including some people within the party. And then you also had this weekend, Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, effectively endorse Robert Kennedy Jr., environmentalist, a big anti-vaccine or vaccine critic, I should say. Those are among the issues that have been prominent for him. He's been critical of Biden in certain ways. It's interesting because he kind of marries certain conservative values, certain liberal values. He's somewhere in between. Definitely doesn't fall under the traditional kind of Democratic umbrella here. But Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, endorsed him over the weekend. So there's certainly a bit of backing for RFK Jr. so far. And then, of course, talk here about, among some in the party, but definitely not prominent people, saying there should be a debate.
I think it speaks to the fact, what we have been talking about for months now, is that the majority of Americans do not want to see President Biden run and do not want to see former President Trump run again. They don't want that election. They don't want that rematch. And I think there's a lot of frustration out there from the electorate just saying, how are we going to get stuck with these guys again? Is there not anybody else? Is our system so broken that we can't elevate somebody different, somebody more moderate, somebody younger? And it seems like, at least right now, we are heading to a Biden-Trump rematch.
There's no shortage of challengers here. We just went through a few of them. America, Republicans in particular. Democrats, you're going to have more of a challenge here because the party is effectively, the party leadership has rallied around Biden here, though there will be primaries if you find an alternative. On the Republican side, there are tons of alternatives. In fact, so many alternatives that you might have Trump again, because again, they're going to all eat into each other and get small percentage points and allow Trump to eke through these primaries, which are typically winner take all, which means Trump could get 22% of the vote in a state, but with everyone else at 17, 12, 11, 5, 5, 5, Trump will take all the delegates and then become the nominee. Because many states, including this was a reform done during the Trump White House, is he helped push through that more states would be winner take all, anticipating a scenario where he's running again. So he has the advantage here. And that's a concern Republicans have, is that too many of you are running again. And we need to decide on who our anti-Trump person is going to be, at least the half of the party that doesn't want him to come back.
All right, moving on. Some big changes could be coming to the way we get news on social media. And it begins in California. Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, may start blocking users in the state from reading, posting, or sharing any news on their feeds. That is, if the state passes a law that would require tech platforms to pay news publishers for the content. The law in dispute is called California's Journalism Prevention Act, which is sort of a weird name, no, Moshe?
I think they tried to keep it tight here. I think the idea here is that companies like Meta and tech companies are preventing journalism from happening. But
they're just missing a few words.
Yeah,
okay. NPR, though, explains it this way. This would basically be a tax on the advertising profits that tech platforms make from distributing news articles. A large majority, about 70% of the money collected from this law, would support newsrooms throughout the state whose advertising revenues have nosedived as more news is consumed on social media. The bill's author is Assemblywoman Buffy Wicks. She argues that it could be a lifeline to local news organizations that have been decimated by the internet boom. Wicks said at a hearing last month that more than 100 California news organizations have shut down in the past decade. And with that, newsrooms have been absolutely decimated.
Yeah, this is a real thing. And by the way, if you read local newspapers, once great local newspapers in California these days, some of them are just filled with national wire copy from the AP and other agencies because they don't have local reporters anymore, especially when you get beyond the front page. The numbers nationally are astonishing here. Nearly 40,000 newsroom jobs have been eliminated over the course of the last decade. More than nearly 400 U.S. newspapers have gone out of business in just the last 3 years. That averages out to 2 per week. And there are entire areas of the country, Jill, that we now call news deserts, where there are just no local papers, not even weekly papers anymore. And as we know, local news are the reporters that are investigating companies that might be polluting in the area, corrupt government officials, informing you about what's going on. And that is a real issue in some communities where they literally just don't know what's happening in their towns and communities anymore.
And at this point, you could argue that national news reporters, even Wall Street and business reporters are probably overrepresented. But then local news is just so underrepresented. And you and I were joking, I think it was because I voted in my school board election a couple of weeks ago, and you were like, kudos for doing your civic duty. And the truth is that school boards, local legislatures, township governments, your village mayor and your trustees, those people are the ones that really hold the purse strings in terms of your taxes. And the decisions that they make, for the most part, have a bigger impact on your life than some of these national politicians that get so much coverage. And these local newsrooms are being decimated, and there's just no accountability. There's nobody covering them.
Right. And they haven't adapted. And some will say this is a free market, and, they didn't know how to manage the business and handle digital. At the same time, many of them, including government officials, point the finger at Meta and the tech companies for basically eating into the entire advertising world that companies once advertised with local newspapers. They no longer do that. They do it with Facebook and they do it with Google, etc. So now news outlets say it's time for Meta to pay up. But Meta says not so fast here. And so what's happening here is Meta saying it'll just stop publishing news. Like, they're done. They're not going to provide news on Instagram and Facebook where bans like this might be put in place. A spokesperson telling NPR, it's pay or remove the news. Our hand is being forced. And Meta's move here is not an empty threat. After Australia, the entire country of Australia, signed a law forcing social platforms like Meta to pay for news a couple years ago, Facebook blocked all news articles across all of Australia. Google was also ready to pull its search engine from the country entirely. Traffic to Australian news websites plummeted. It shows how powerful these tech websites are at news distribution. Eventually, though, in the Australian example, they gave in and settled with Australia and made a deal to pay news publishers. One Columbia journalism professor did the math. He found it generated nearly $150 million for news organizations down under. That is a game changer for media organizations struggling to survive in this digital era. Jill, this California thing still ongoing, but we're already going to see a bit of this in Canada. Canada, following the example of Australia here, also has a piece of legislation going through Parliament there that's going to force tech companies like Meta to pay news organizations. In a blog post last week, Meta said it's going to start cutting off news content on Instagram and Facebook in Canada, randomized if you're a Canadian news user, and also randomized for news outlets, but to give folks a sense that they're serious here with that threat. So again, we went back and forth in Australia. Canada is doing this to try to save their news industry. And here in the U.S., at least, you see the move in California.
Back to California, the state Senate still needs to approve the bill. The governor needs to sign it. California, the first U.S. state to try this type of model. Depending on how it goes, though, it could be the first of many. Meanwhile, a sign of how much turmoil there is in the news industry, Gannett, which is the biggest newspaper chain in the country, they're going to be hit by the biggest staff walkout in history. Employees are protesting the company's leadership for basically gutting the newsroom to cut costs.
Yeah, Gannett, known for USA Today and hundreds of newspapers across the country, just one of the major companies that, again, is seeing such diminished ad revenue that they're forced for cuts, and then now you have the staff protesting that. Jill, there are a number of legislators in Washington who are looking at Australia, Canada, saying we got to adopt this nationally, while California looks at this on an individual state level. There was a provision in the Build Back Better bill last year initially that would have instituted this nationally. That was taken out as Build Back Better was cut in size as they negotiated that deal last year in Congress. The ongoing debate, again, that this is the private media sphere. What role should government have in trying to build it up? Keep in mind, though, free press is in the Constitution, right? It's in the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment. So it's one of the only professions and industries that's written into the Constitution, folks in the media would tell you. Jill, we'd also got a few questions from people asking, what does this mean for Mo News?
What does it mean for Mo News?
Well, it is a big question because everything is still up in the air. It is up to Meta and Instagram, et cetera, to determine what is news, what are the news platforms, and what do they block. And we're at their whim. It's one of the reasons, actually, Jill, I should mention, we're launching Mo News Premium, and we've been trying to expand to this podcast and newsletter, et cetera, this is the wild, wild west right now, and how things turn out in social media are still up in the air. And so, we will keep you up to date on what it means. Ideally, we get some sort of alert saying we're blocking you now in certain countries. That's how they've explained it. In the meantime, though, one way you can support us continuing to do what we do and expanding in this sort of murky environment is by joining Mo News Premium. You can do that over at mo.news/premium for just $7 a month. Get access to our private Instagram account, extra podcasts, and more. Help sustain us. Again, that is Mo News Premium. We're also offering 2 free months right now on the annual Mo News Premium package at mo.news/premium. Had to put in a plug there, Jill, because we're also looking to survive and thrive in this crazy environment, this crazy media world.
All right, time now for the speed read from the Washington Post. With just 2 days to spare, President Biden signed legislation on Saturday that lifts the nation's debt ceiling, averting an unprecedented default on the federal government's debt. It ended the months-long drama that unnerved financial markets at home and abroad and caused anxious retirees and social service organizations to make contingency plans in case the country was unable to pay all of its bills. The Treasury Department had warned that the country would start to run out of money today. That final agreement passed by Republicans and Democrats in the House on Wednesday and then the Senate on Thursday suspends the debt limit until 2025 after the next presidential election and restricts government spending. It gives lawmakers budget targets for the next 2 years in hopes of assuring fiscal stability as the political season heats up.
Yeah, Jill, if you're a journalist, don't make vacation plans yet for Christmas 2024 into New Year's Eve 2025, because that's the next deadline. So as they typically do in Washington, they've kicked the can for about 18 months here. They got a deal, and we knew they would get a deal, but they would wait until the end. They cut this one super close, again, 48 hours out. Biden gave an address to the nation. Many of you probably missed it on Friday night from the Oval Office. He spoke briefly about bipartisanship, said that neither side is happy, but the country got what it needed. And, it is possible for Democrats and Republicans to come to compromises in Washington. Many Republicans declared victory, saying they got Biden to budge. They got him to negotiate. He had resisted for months to negotiate. He wanted a clean debt ceiling lift with no cuts on his side. Eventually, Republicans forced him to the table. And so they were able to say they were able to get some needed agreements there in this 99-page bill, including new work requirements for older Americans who receive food aid. They greenlit a new natural gas pipeline that runs from West Virginia to Virginia that many Democrats had opposed and still oppose. That includes environmentalists who are very critical and up in arms over this agreement. Some environmental rules were modified to help streamline approvals for these energy projects. And you do have some agreements here from Democrats about how much they can spend in the coming year. And so that's where we're at here. The debt ceiling officially suspended, which means basically the government can spend what it needs to, borrow what it needs to pay its bills for the next 18 months. And then we'll be right back at here, same bad time, same bad channel, Jill, to discuss the next debt ceiling crisis in just about 18 months.
From the AP now, a heads up to everybody who has been enjoying cheaper gas prices the last few months and who hasn't. Saudi Arabia says that it will again reduce how much oil it sends to the global economy, taking a unilateral step to prop up the price of crude oil. And this is after 2 previous cuts to supply by major producing countries in what's called the OPEC alliance had failed to push oil prices higher. The Saudi cut of 1 million barrels a day, which will start in July, comes as the other OPEC plus producers like Russia and Mexico agreed in a meeting in Vienna to extend earlier production cuts through next year. The new cut would likely push up oil prices in the short term, but the impact after that would depend on whether Saudi Arabia decides to extend it.
Yeah, so these previous cuts, which we reported on this podcast, gave a boost to oil prices. That's big for countries like Saudi Arabia, Russia, all the major oil producers, because when they cut production, that means less supply, which means prices go up, right? Because they bet on demand continuing to be what it is. So that actually pushed prices up to $87 a barrel. But then prices then started to come down again because demand hasn't been as high as they suspected. And so crude oil is back down to $70 a barrel. These countries like to keep it closer to $90 a barrel, Jill, to help prop up their economies. The Saudis need sustained high oil revenue to fund very ambitious, very expensive development projects that they're using right now to diversify their economy. And so those 2 previous cuts didn't work. They're trying another cut here. And in the meantime, U.S. drivers have been enjoying the benefits of these lower prices. The average being about $3.50. That's down $1 from a year ago at this time. The energy prices also welcome in Europe, where they've seen prices the lowest since Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, the Saudis are hoping to bring those prices back up again. It will be interesting, though, because these are a variety of countries. You have the OPEC hardcore oil producers, then you have what you called OPEC Plus, which are these extra countries, Mexico, Russia, beyond OPEC, and they all shake hands and make these agreements, but some of them don't abide by these agreements. For example, the Russians will talk about cutting, but they need so much money to fund their war, they haven't actually followed through on certain cuts. So it remains to be seen whether they all follow through with what the Saudis called for here. And it's a really tricky dance these OPEC countries play here on the global economy, because they want to cut production to increase prices, but they don't want prices to go so high, typically not more too much above $100 a barrel, because that then hurts the economies, brings up inflation, and then ends up cutting demand. So they're really playing with the dials of the global economy here to try to get as much profit as possible without completely burning and wrecking the global economy.
From the Guardian newspaper, a loud noise rocked D.C. on Sunday afternoon and sent some residents into a brief panic. It turns out it was a sonic boom from a flight authorized by the U.S. Department of Defense, according to officials, and it came as jet fighters were scrambled to pursue a light aircraft that had violated airspace in the Washington area and later crashed into a mountainous terrain in Southwest Virginia. The jet fighters caused that sonic boom over the U.S. Capitol as they raced to catch up with the Cessna Citation business aircraft. The FAA saying that Cessna aircraft crashed in Southwest Virginia around the time the sonic boom was heard in the Capitol. A U.S. official said the jet fighters did not cause the crash.
Yeah, Reuters is reporting that the Cessna was believed to be on autopilot. Apparently, the pilot unattentive, sadly, and wasn't responding to authorities' efforts to make contact with it. It was not clear why the pilot was unresponsive. They are investigating details there. This aircraft, a civilian aircraft, had taken off from an airport in Tennessee, was bound for Long Island MacArthur Airport in New York, ended up making a big U-turn and was off course by 300 miles, eventually makes a U-turn around Long Island and back towards Virginia, crosses into restricted airspace, which they take very seriously, especially after 9/11, and that's what led to all of this. That plane, by the way, was registered to Encore Motors of Melbourne, Florida. Some reporters have been reaching out to them to try to learn more details. Tragic, though, several people aboard that plane. But certainly, Jill, a number of Mo News listeners had messaged me on Sunday afternoon being like, what's with the huge explosion in Washington? People were hearing it in Virginia, in Maryland. I mean, a sonic boom over the air of Washington, certainly led to a lot of fear yesterday.
Heading overseas from the BBC, an electronic signaling system error led to the train derailment in India that killed nearly 300 people and injured hundreds more. That is according to officials in the country on Sunday. The error caused a train to wrongly change tracks and crash into a freight train in India's eastern state of Odisha, creating a disastrous pileup that involved a second passenger train as well. It is one of the country's deadliest rail accidents in decades. An Odisha government statement announced the updated death toll of 275 people on Sunday. More than 850 others were injured as of Saturday night. Over the weekend, the Indian Army assisted police and the National Disaster Response Force, as well as other rescue teams, to search for survivors.
Jill, the trains collectively were carrying 2,300 people. The crash occurred at a time where the prime minister there, Narendra Modi, has been focused on modernizing their colonial-era railroad network in India. It is now the world's most populous country with 1.42 billion people. And despite government efforts to improve safety, several hundred accidents do occur every year, though this is one of the most significant in recent years. Jill, the numbers here are startling. 8 billion people a year ride Indian trains, 22 million people a day, 14,000 trains, 40,000 miles of track. So it is a lot for them to manage. In fact, the prime minister was going to be inaugurating the next day some brand new improvements to the railroad. He, of course, has postponed that given this tragedy and as they continue the investigation.
From CBS News, Churchill Downs, home of the Kentucky Derby, announced on Friday that they would suspend racing after 12 horse deaths that happened in 1 month at their famed racetrack. Race operations at Churchill Downs will cease this week, and the remainder of the season will take place at Ellis Park in Henderson, Kentucky. The company said even though subsequent investigations had determined no single factor or pattern related to the racetrack, the company said that even though investigations had determined, quote, no single factor or pattern related to the racetrack has been identified as a potential cause of the deaths, the racetrack needed to be closed. The CEO of Churchill Downs saying in a statement that, quote, what has happened to our track is deeply upsetting and absolutely unacceptable. Despite our best efforts to identify a cause for the recent horse injuries, and though no issues have been linked to our racing surfaces or environment at Churchill Downs, we need to take more time to conduct a top-to-bottom review.
Yeah, so 4 horses died in the opening of Kentucky Derby week. 2 of the horses died from unknown causes when they both suddenly collapsed after completing their races. 5 others were euthanized after training and racing incidents at the track in the days leading up to the Derby. All 12 horses were put down after suffering serious injuries on the racetrack. But again, they haven't figured out the collective cause here, or even if there's an issue with the racetrack itself. So it isn't clear yet what changes they need to make. They have announced other changes and policy changes when it comes to horse racing on the track. That includes restricting horses to 4 starts over an 8-week period. The racetrack will also establish new ineligibility standards for horses that finish more than 12 lengths back. Again, the idea here, not forcing horses into the race if it appears there are issues with them. But Jill, this is an industry that is facing a lot of scrutiny right now, given the deaths that we've seen there in Churchill Downs, as well as recently in California. And there's a lot of speculation about what drugs are used to make these horses run faster, etc. So there does seem to be a moment here when it comes to horse racing where with these deaths, there are going to be some potential real changes to the industry.
And from Variety now, if you're looking to take a break from actual reality, perhaps after listening to this podcast so far, Apple has a new product for you. The tech company is widely expected to announce its first VR headset at its Worldwide Developer Conference today. The headset is Apple's biggest new product introduction since the Apple Watch 8 years ago, though analysts say it's all but certain that the device will not see anywhere close to the sales numbers that Apple's other wearables have enjoyed post-launch. Many details of the device have leaked in recent months. It will likely be called Reality One or Reality Pro. It will run a customized version of iOS dubbed XROS and come with a whopping $3,000 price tag. For that money, consumers will get a lightweight headset described a bit like ski goggles. The device won't require a computer or phone to run immersive apps, but it will rely on an external battery pack meant to be carried around in a pocket and connect via a short cable. The headset will be equipped with outward-facing cameras capable of piping a live video feed of people's surroundings into the headset, where this so-called pass-through video view can be combined with virtual elements, an approach known as mixed reality. Consumers will reportedly be able to switch back and forth quickly between a view of the real world and complete VR immersion via a physical dial or button. It will reportedly run a number of first and third-party virtual reality apps, including games, fitness, and meditation apps, as well as the ability to watch movies, sports, and other live events in VR. The device will likely offer access to existing iPad apps, including many of Apple's own apps and services.
So, Jill, I come to you today on a MacBook, and I have an iPhone, and we have an Apple TV in the house. And the bet Apple is making is that many of us who have the other Apple devices will at some point be buying these reality goggles. Though, as you described it, these VR goggles with mixed reality with a battery pack in your pocket, I don't see myself walking around Brooklyn with one of these anytime soon. But, right now, virtual reality has been big in the gaming world. And the question is can they make it, at least to begin with, a part of your home entertainment experience? One of the interesting things, Jill, as I was reading this Variety piece, was that they're going to try to differentiate this from existing VR gear by also having an outward-facing display to show the facial expression of the headset wearer to bystanders. So I guess you'll look less weird because your face will be projected on the goggles over your eyes.
This feels like such a nightmare.
They say this is a feature meant to make wearing the device less of an isolating experience. Apparently, you'll also be able to FaceTime through these goggles if you don't enjoy FaceTiming directly to your phone. Right now, we're looking for a different experience. Meta tried to get ahead of Apple last week by announcing the latest version of their Quest goggles here. And you can make two arguments about this, that VR ain't happening, or that Apple has been a game changer in a number of industries. Apple will tell you, iPhone got off to a slow start as people tried to get around not having a keyboard, that the watch got off to a slow start and sales quickly picked up. And they, hope for the same thing to happen in this VR space. Again, it depends. Will this just be a gaming thing, or will this move on to other things? Meta's made its attempt to try to get you into the metaverse, so to speak. And so Apple, by the way, has lowered expectations here. Initially, they were hoping for 3 million of these goggles to be sold in the first year. Now it looks like they're just expecting 900,000 of them to be sold at $3,000 a pop.
Okay, June 5th, 2023, Moshe. This will either be my worst call or my best call ever. I think this is a bust. I don't think that regular people want this. Gamers, perhaps. Perhaps you'll see this being used for the military, in hospitals, doctors who are going to be able to do surgeries a different way. I don't see, at least the way that we just described it, regular people and myself just being a regular person having any desire. Maybe I would try it in a store just for fun for 20 minutes or so. I can't see spending $3,000 for a pair of these.
So you don't see us next year at this time recording this podcast through our Apple VR goggles?
Listen, I am somebody who's also holding onto my BlackBerry for dear life and didn't think that I was ever going to convert to an iPhone. So I'm not saying never, and I could certainly be wrong about this. Just my initial instinct is that this is a bust, and no one wanted the Snap glasses. They were a total disaster.
Snapchat tried to introduce
spectacles, I think is what they were called. Right. It was a total bomb. It just doesn't feel like, it just feels like the tech companies are trying to come up with a new gadget because it's obviously so lucrative for them. And the public doesn't really seem to be interested.
It reminds you of the Mean Girls quote, "Stop trying to make fetch happen."
Exactly.
Virtual reality happen. All right, let's go to On This Day in History on this June 5th. We'll start in 1968 on this day, Jill. While running for president, Robert F. Kennedy was fatally assassinated on this day by an assassin named Sirhan Sirhan in the Ambassador Hotel in L.A. He would die the following day. Kennedy, at that point, had major momentum behind him and was on his way to becoming the Democratic nominee that year for president. I should add here, Jill, as we mentioned previously on the podcast, his son, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., currently running for president himself. All right, fast forward to 1981. Today, June 5th, 1981, the CDC put out its first weekly report describing a rare lung infection it said they found among a group of gay men in LA. The article called it a type of pneumonia. It would mark the first time that the disease that would later become known as AIDS was described in a report. A few physicians and public health workers in coastal cities at the time had noticed strange infections in otherwise healthy gay men in the years prior, but the report served to put the phenomenon on the record. It would take a couple of years, though, before the government would start to take that more seriously. All right, Jill, moving on to pop culture. As we teased at the top of the podcast, on this day in 1985, Ferris Bueller and a couple of friends took the day off. So some internet sleuths, so it's not official in the movie, but some internet sleuths have been trying to figure it out for years. Like, what was the day Ferris Bueller took off? Because, you know, who among us doesn't have a few hours on their hands to try to figure out and scrutinize film footage? Well, based on the footage of the baseball game they attended, the Cubs game that they showed in the movie that day, it appears to have been from a June 5th, 1985 game. Others, though, dispute it, Jill. They've scrutinized the footage, and they believe, based on that and the parade they were in, it had to have been a day in September. We here at Mo News, though, Jill, I should say, are going to go with June 5th. I think we're making that call.
As the Chicago native here, I think I'm very comfortable with you making this decision for us as an organization.
Jill, by the way, in 1985 being a big year for iconic moments in film. So June 5th, 1985, we believe was the date that Ferris Bueller took off. October 26th of that year is the day that Michael J. Fox and Doc would go into the future. I should say go into the past. So 85, a big year in kind of fake movie date history, if you will.
Roads, where we're going, we don't need roads.
Jill, I'm very comfortable with you making the call. That is the quote from Back to the Future. All right, Jill, we're going to end here with a little bit of music history. Jill, that is Alicia Keys' Fallen from her debut studio album, Songs in A Minor. It came out today, 22 years ago today, June 5th, 2001.
She has since, Moshe, won 15 Grammy Awards. She's a New York Times best-selling author. She's an accomplished actress. And she was on The Voice as a coach for a few seasons. Yeah, and of course, she's married to artist-producer Swiss Beats. They have a couple kids together. And, you know, continues to really be in the zeitgeist. She's influential also when it comes to activism and philanthropy, etc. So mark this date when many of us were introduced to her for the first time. All right, we want to thank you for listening to the Mo News Daily Podcast. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store so we can continue to grow. Jill, it's good to be back. I hope we aren't too rusty for everybody. I feel like hopefully we caught you up on the most important things happening this past weekend. And for those of you looking for more, please consider joining Mo News Premium over at mo.news/premium. Also, subscribing to our newsletter. Now daily. It's been out for a few weeks now, getting great feedback there. So you can go do that over at mo.news as well. Subscribe to our daily newsletter. And thanks everyone who wrote in and messaged us about the podcast. I have to say, Moshe, I really missed it. I missed working with you. I missed putting the stories together. I missed listening to it. I like listening to it when it comes out in the morning. So it's good to be back. Jill, it is good to be back. I'll see everyone back here tomorrow.